In America, we've had herbivores. We've had Spotify growing, Apple growing, Amazon growing, YouTube growing. Everybody's reporting growth. Pandora even is growing. What we're going to see some point soon is carnivores, which is Apple will grow by eating into Spotify's growth, or YouTube will grow by eating into Amazon's growth. So the key question we got to ask is, when do we go from the herbivore market that we're in today to a carnivore market of tomorrow?
All right, today we got the one and only Will Page with us. He is well known in the music and media space as an economist, but he also spent a lot of time as a DJ. And I feel like that could be a good place for us to start the conversation, Will. Talk to me about your DJ experience and what you've been doing there recently.
Well, I've been DJing since the age of puberty, and it was all inspired by one lyric by a rapper called Mike G from the Jungle Brothers, from an album called Done by the Forces of Nature, where he dropped this line where he said, "It's about getting the music across, the message across, getting it across without crossing over." And I'm like a 14-year-old kid when I hear this. And I just thought about those words, getting the music across without crossing over. How do you get art to an audience without diluting its integrity? I'm only 14 at the time, but that just resonated with me so strongly. And I just kind of dedicated a huge chunk of my life to trying to get music across to an audience that would otherwise not have heard it. And I'm not diluting how it's being presented. That's what a DJ can do. You can thread songs together in a way that gets music across without its dilution, without crossing it over.
For sure. And I feel like that's a good segue to chat a little bit more about some of the work you've done for a company that is very heavily focused on playlist, which is Spotify. And I think more
Mhm.
broadly, looking at the streaming era we're in right now, this is a great time to chat because we just saw the IFPI results and streaming is continuing to grow as we've seen. But I feel like you probably spotted a few interesting trends about where things are heading. And I think that's a question mark for a lot of people. Streaming continues to grow, but how far can it grow? What are we seeing in terms of differences within genres or regions? What are some of the things that stuck out to you?
I'll give you a couple. The first one is the global business. Well, last time I looked at the United Nations, I think there's 208 countries in the world. The global yearbook that we're discussing here has, I think, 58. So we have to be careful what we define as global. I think Africa's clubbed together as one continent. They need to work on that. But I think the global business is growing, but it's also becoming more American. So if you go back to when Spotify launched, America made up 22, 23% of the business, around about just over a fifth. Today it's 37%. So we have seen the business grow and become more American. And that raises questions, economic questions like globalization questions. Should poor countries catch up with rich ones? The theory says yes. The reality often says no. So we're seeing this kind of lopsided growth where the business is growing, but it's growing in favor of an American market. The biggest country is growing at the fastest rates. That's a positive problem, but I just want to flag it, which is that's not how it was supposed to play out. And then the second thing I'd want to point to as well is just vinyl. This vinyl recovery is just, well, I don't know how much of my bank balance is responsible for this vinyl recovery, but I'm telling you, it's defying the laws of gravity now. We're now looking at vinyl being worth $1.5 billion, which is more than it's been worth in the past 30 years. It's worth more than CDs, cassettes, and downloads, the three formats that were supposed to declare that vinyl is dead. But there's two things you can kind of cut out of the vinyl recovery, which I think will be of real interest to your audience. Firstly, on the consumer side, I saw a survey which suggested that the majority, just over half of all vinyl buyers today, don't own a record player. I mean, something's cooking here. So, what are we buying it for? I'll extend that as well. The cost of wall frames to frame vinyl on your wall often cost more than the record itself. So, I'm willing to pay more for vinyl to be framed on my wall than I am for the record. And by the way, I don't have a record player. There's a lot of people who will tick those bizarre boxes. But on the creator side, something else is interesting. This will take a little bit of working through, but if we think about the streaming model, it's monetizing consumption. That's what it does. So if there's an album with 10 songs, 3 killer and 7 filler songs on an album, and let's say Dan Runcie wrote the 3 killer tracks and Will Page, he wrote the 7 Duff filler tracks. On streaming, Dan might walk away with all the money and I'll walk away with none because we're only streaming the killer tracks and nobody's touching the filler. As the album model kicks out from vinyl, I would get 70% of the cash. That's crazy because nobody knows what's being consumed. And it's a lot of cash. If I just kind of do some rough math here of 1 million fans streaming your hip hop record on Spotify, and let's say they're streaming it 200 times in a month when the album drops, you only need 20,000 of them, of that million, to make the same amount of money from vinyl than you would do from streams, which is entirely plausible. But then how do you pay the copyright owners from those songs on an album is very different from how you pay them on a stream. If you go back to the late 70s, one of the most successful records of all time was Saturday Night Fever, the Bee Gees, and a bunch of other people. It's crazy to think that Ralph McDonald's Calypso Strut, his record there, which nobody has listened to, got the same royalty as Staying Alive by the Bee Gees because it was a vinyl record. So to reiterate, on the consumer side, I don't know how many of these vinyl records are being played. And on the creator side, it raises questions about how these creators are going to get paid.
That's a good point, but that I don't think is being talked about as much about the vinyl search because there's so much like wow about just how much is being purchased. I think I even saw the stat that Adele's 30 album sold 8,000 cassettes, or there was some type of stat about that. And I think the similar thing that you said lines up. How many of those people actually still own a Walkman or whatever type of cassette player
Yeah.
that they have? So I do think that that is something that probably there could be a deeper analysis on because a lot of the people that write the filler songs, how do they feel, or whether you're a songwriter, whether you know what's behind it, especially when you know that there's so much clear path to be able to determine, okay, this is going to be the lead single, or this is what we're going to push most from this album. It really shifts things even more to where things are going in terms of a single market, and like the way that people have talked about pop music for a while now, right? And I guess that brings me back to the streaming trends that you mentioned overall. We're in this area, as you mentioned, streaming itself, the US penetration has grown from 22%, I believe you said is now through 35, 37, somewhere around there. But where do we go from here? Because as you've written before, the price of music streaming, at least the monthly subscription, hasn't necessarily been increasing. The average revenue per user overall, because of the international growth, is decreased. And you have plenty of people that are still trying to get their fair share of what they can in streaming. So it's in like 5, 10 years from now, if you could see into the future, where do you think streaming distribution is? I think the good thing is that people have smartphones and there's more and more growth from that perspective. So streaming is going to grow. But on the other hand, the economics of these things do have some theoretical point where we've maximized the global penetration of this. What do you think about where that is going?
Let me unpack it in two different lanes. Firstly, I'll deal with the saturation point question, which is, how long can this party keep going for? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Who's going to call time on it? And then secondly, I want to deal with the pricing point on its own lane as well. But on saturation point, you're now in a situation where I'd put it as in America, we've had herbivores. We've had Spotify growing, Apple growing, Amazon growing, YouTube growing. Everybody's reporting growth. Pandora even is growing. What we're going to see some point soon is carnivores, which is Apple will grow by eating into Spotify's growth, or YouTube will grow by eating into Amazon's growth. So the key question we got to ask is, when do we go from the herbivore market that we're in today to a carnivore market of tomorrow? And I would put Spotify's US subscriber number around about 45 million. I'd put Apple at 49 million. If you dump on top YouTube, Amazon, Pandora, you're well past 110, 120 million. Now, that's important because I reckon there's around about 110 million qualifying households in America that has at least one person who could pay for a streaming service. This is crucial because if you look at what Apple One's bundle is doing, $30 a month for news, music, television, gaming, fitness, and 2 terabits of storage per 6 account holder, it's a household proposition. They're saying to the home, I got you. Convenience, everyone under this roof is covered with Apple products. So when you have 110 million households and you have more than 110 million subscribers in the United States, then we're in a race to the finishing line before herbivores turn into carnivores. In oil, we have this expression called peak oil, which is we know that we've extracted more oil in the world than is left to extract, and the oil that's left is going to be even more costly to get out the ground. I think we're in peak subscriber territory, where at some point soon we're going to start seeing growth happen through stealing other customers as opposed to finding your own. So I just want to put that warning flag out there. Just now we're partying like it's 1989, fine, but at some point the party has to come to an end, and growth is going to come at the expense of other players. That then flips, from the A side to the B side of this record, we flip it over to price. And then the pricing debate is interesting. I published this work called Malb Economics, which we can cite on your wonderful website there, which was to look at 20-year history of the $9.99 price point. And it's a crazy story. Back in the 3rd of December 2001, over 20 years ago today, Rhapsody got its license for a $9.99 offering, which had 15,000 songs. First point, the origins of $9.99 bizarrely date back to the Blockbuster rental card. Some coked up label executive would have said if it cost $9.99 to rent videos from Blockbuster, that's what it should cost to rent music. And secondly, there was only 15,000 songs with limited use case. There was no smartphone back then, no apps, no algorithms. That was all a weird world into the future. So you just had $9.99 for 15,000 songs. We're now chatting in early April 2022, and it's still $9.99 in dollar, in euro, in sterling. But we're offering 100 million songs. That's the crazy thing. So in the article Malb Economics, what I do is I strip inflation out. In the case of the UK, $9.99 has fallen down to £6.30. Remember, family plan makes music cheaper too. If 2.3 people are paying $14.99, that's £6.50. There's way too many numbers in this conversation for Trapital, but still, we'll stick with it. Student plan makes it cheaper too. So music in real terms has fallen to £6.30, which is less than a medium glass of Malbec wine. So 175 milliliters of Malbec wine costs more than 100 million songs, which is available offline, on demand, without adverts. That for me is certified bonkers. I don't understand what we've done. We're offering more and more, and we're charging less and less. And you only have to leave the ears to the eyes and look at video streaming to see what they're doing on the other side of the fence. Netflix has got me from $7.99 to $8.99 to $12.99 to now $14.99 in the space of 15 months, and I haven't blinked. Disney Plus, the reason I'm paying $4.99 on Disney Plus is because I paid $19.99 to get Cruella live on demand. So they're charging more and more, but only offering part of the world's repertoire set for eyeball content. We're charging less and less and offering more and more of the world's earhole content. So it's like two ships passing each other in the night. It's a very interesting dilemma.
It's intriguing because when you look at the way that video is structured, as you mentioned, you have all these price increases, and I think Netflix for some plans is, $18.99. It's approaching that level. But in music, it's this thing where, yeah, there's some price differences where I think I saw today that Amazon Music is increasing it $1, but that's from $7.99 for Prime subscribers to them being $8.99. So it still hasn't
Oh
crossed that
no. I
threshold.
wonder if my work caused that.
I mean, honestly, I feel like there's something here because when I think about this, I think about a few things, right? Obviously, you do have this fight where the artists want to get more and the labels want to get more, not just for the artists, but for themselves. And obviously, Spotify wants to earn more. Logically, you would think, okay, if you increase the price and people just understanding the economics of what's likely, if Spotify increased up to $12.99 a month for the standard base rate, how many folks would blink? But to your point earlier, I have to imagine that the fear is looking at the trends and where that penetration is. If they jump up to 13.9 or 12.99, then they're going to lose those customers to the other streaming services that haven't jumped there yet because of that thought of, shifting to that carnivore mentality of competing with each other. So because for roughly 80% of the content that they do offer, it is roughly the same between each of these services. It's lent
Yeah.
it to be more of a price war than in video streaming, where most of them do have some differentiated content.
100%. And two things to bolt onto your very eloquent points there. Firstly, let's just remind ourselves that Apple launched superior sound quality. You may remember the commercial of lossless audio. You buy your AirPods, which cost 2 years of Apple Music or Spotify to put in your ears, and you get superior sound quality. The subtext underneath it said at no extra cost. That was the actual marketing message. So there again, we're improving the offer. We're supplying more, but we're charging less in real terms. And that's a really interesting kind of point to kind of cut into. The second thing, and we should get balance into this discussion because it's delicate, is we have to remind ourselves that, if there's 120 million subscribers in America, there's still another 120 million to go. But we know they're not that interested in paying for music because they haven't paid yet. Now, the best way to attract them is not necessarily to raise price. So we got to remember that there's still, oil to extract. It's not going to be easy oil to extract, but the best way to get to it might not be to raise price. But there's a catch to this. I can remember in the early noughties, right up to 2010, piracy ripping the ass out of this business. And concert promoters were saying, we love piracy because the kids are getting music for free so they can pay more on concert tickets. I wonder if now they're saying, we love Spotify because they don't raise prices, which means we can raise ours. This is not a discussion of how to rip off the customer. This is a discussion about value exchange. And I just wonder whether recorded music is leaving value on the table. That's the key point to hammer home.
Mm, that's a good point. And I think that also made me think too, could there be some notion of maintaining the perception of Spotify as something that still has high pricing power and still has high consumer surplus, because then that helps the stock price. And then seeing that the major labels are all invested in Spotify itself, it's about like having that perception of, the future growth and whatever it is. So what you just said made me think about that being a factor potentially too.
100%. And of course, you've got to distinguish the Spotify, Apple Music cost structure from that of the video streaming companies, in that they have a kind of variable cost. You double your business, you double your cost base. Whereas Netflix, you jump up costs and you jump up your revenue. You raise me from $7.99 to $14.99. The cost of that content was fixed, and I'm still consuming the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air on Netflix to this day. That was a fixed cost deal that he did to get that content, and that's margin to Netflix. So the cost structure matters in this one as well.
Definitely. And you mentioned live music there, and I think there's a lot to think about from that perspective. I feel like we're in this post pandemic, I mean, we're still not out of it, but we're in this post quarantine era. More artists than ever are trying to tour and get out there, trying to capture what's there. But also from an economic perspective, from that, most people are only going to go to a certain number of live events per year. And we have this 18 to 24-month run coming up where everyone wants to make up for what they couldn't do in the past 2 years. How will that shift not just who then goes on tour together and then how they may split those profits, what the availability looks like, and if they're not able to do what they may have done on tour in the late 2010s, how does that affect future touring? I think that's a piece of it that, you know, we still haven't necessarily seen the impact of, but it just feels inevitable based on where things are
Right.
heading.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, on touring, I was lucky and I got to do some great work on the UK live industry. And I can only speak for the UK here. I know a lot of your audience is in the US, but I think these points will carry across. The first one was to work out how much is spent on concert tickets in Britain during the normal year of 2019. And the answer was £1.7 billion. That's more than was spent on recorded music, a lot more than was spent on recorded music, which makes sense. You pay £120 on the Spotify account, you're paying £240 to go to the Reading Festival. 2 days in a muddy field in Reading cost more than 365 days of all the world's music. But what I noticed there was the industry is changing in its growth. I showed that between 2012, the year of the London Olympics, and 2019, the live music industry in this country had exploded in growth, but it was lopsided. All the growth came from stadiums, festivals, and to a lesser extent, arenas. The theatres, the 2,000, 3,000 capacity theatres, like the Fillmore West over where you are, they were getting crushed. They were actually shrinking in size. So we have this lopsided live music industry, which is going right in the direction of the head as opposed to the long tail, the stadiums, the festivals, the arenas, as opposed to the theatres, the clubs, the university venues. And that's interesting because that's going to change the dynamics of how you make money from live. Do you go from doing your tour of an album to doing a tour of your festivals for that record? And what does that mean for the cost structure, for the insurance, and all those things that bands have to consider when they're hitting the road? And credit to Trapital, you've had some great podcasts recently on this topic, but there's a big rethink coming along in this live music market. It's not the same as we had back in 2019. It's changed fundamentally. And it is the breadwinner for most artists' income. I think it makes up about 70% of what an artist has to live for comes from the road. That vanished. How do we get it back?
I feel like Cardi B has been a good case study on this specific point here, right? It's been 4 years now since she released an album, and she's yet to go on a true proper tour in that time. That said, she's done plenty of festivals where she's earned more on those festival guarantees than she likely would on tour. And she's also done many private events where she's likely earned that same amount, if not more. So there's a whole economic argument to be made. And I think there's also some risk involved too, right? I think that
Mhm.
festivals do give you the opportunity to get that major bag, you get the high number, the revenue that comes through, but maybe your fans will be a little bit more forgiving if your set piece at your festival isn't the most extravagant thing, especially if you're not the headliner at it. But on a tour, I think it changes. There's a little bit more pressure. Everyone wants to see that Instagrammable or TikTokable moment to then sell
Yeah.
future tickets, and just the production cost and everything with traveling. It still is something that is very worthwhile, but I think we've just started to see some of that segmentation there, especially for someone like her. I would add the residencies too. I know she's done a few different things in Vegas here and there, but yeah, still yet to do that 30 city worldwide tour.
Yeah, I think you got to think with your head and your heart. Your head says, like you point out, the economics favors festivals. Your backline's there, your insurance is covered, travel's already covered. I mean, I've booked numerous hip hop bands to perform at festivals in Europe, and that was one of the big advantages. The costs are all taken care of by the festival. But your heart says, what does that do to intimate relationships with your
Right.
fans? I mean, you're staring at 50,000 strangers in a muddy field. That's different from staring at 2,000 friends in the Fillmore West. So the head and the heart's got to come into play here. What I would add, though, is that there are rumors, I would say, here in the UK at least, that the promoters are saying, I'll pay you a ton of money to perform at the festival to make sure that you don't go on tour. And that's an interesting situation. If you build one too many houses, you collapse the property market. If you have one too many tours or one too many festivals, you collapse the live music industry. So there's ways in which people are trying to restrain the market to festivals at the expense of the theaters. And that certainly is coming through in the data. We're seeing the theater business take a kick in while festivals go on a roll.
Yeah, because I think about, you look at the artists that are touring stadiums now, whether it's your Taylor Swifts or Beyonce's, they wouldn't be able to do that if they didn't have the individual tours at smaller venues when they were starting out, being able to build that intimate fan base. Like you said, like you get to that point, right? And I do think
Yeah.
that as good as festivals can be, it is much more of a lucrative cash grab that is, I don't want to say necessarily short term thinking, but I think you ideally want to have some type of balance there, right? Get the big bag that you can get from something else. It's almost no different than, I think, running a business, right? Okay, sure, you may be able to do a speaking fee or do some type of, thing here or there, but you can't do that all the time, especially if it's not an audience you're tapped into. You still need to do some of the things that can set you up for the long game.
Yeah, and there's an infographic that I'll share with you to pass on to your audience here. I wrote an article in The Economist called "Smells Like Middle-Aged Spirit" as opposed to Teen Spirit. Nice play on words. Hat tip to Dave Grohl and Kurt Cobain. But what I was looking at was the average age of festival headliners over time. This is a dour, pessimistic Scottish economist. This is what you do with your spare time, okay? So in the 90s, when Radiohead did Glastonbury, the average age of a festival headliner was 25, 26 years old. And now all these hot bands were coming through the Britpop era. There was so much development of new talent. By 2012, I think it had got up to 58. And I got a lot of criticism for that article, but then Glastonbury that year had The Who and Lionel Richie headlining, which I think was 70 and 73 years old apart. And then you can see the conveyor belt problem, which is okay, it's a quick cash grab, it makes sense, but that's not the conveyor belt of how we develop talent for tomorrow. That's just how we cash in our chips at the casino today. So it does raise questions. I'm not saying it's like the doomsday scenario here, but we just need a healthy balance of, a seedbed for future growth, and then the big stage for exploiting that moment today, which could be the pyramid stage at Glastonbury, the headline stage at Bonnaroo over in the States. So I just think we're getting a little bit lopsided here. We're a bit short-termist in how this business needs to develop.
Agreed on that. Switching gears a bit, one thing that you wrote recently that stuck out to me, you did this deep dive on music publishing. And I think this is another
Mm.
area that kind of has some of that short term, long term perspective on it, because you look at the people who get the share of the copyright pie, at least today. And from a music streaming perspective, a lot of that has been much more in the favor of the recorded side and then the people getting compensated on the recording side. But with that, the songwriters and the publishers, a lot of them necessarily in that time frame didn't get a lot of that. But I think in this wave now where we're seeing more catalog deals and we're seeing people understand the value of that, things may be starting to shift, and there's likely other things as well. But what do you think about the way that the publishing side has been seen and what the future opportunities are for that side of the business?
Well, the way that labels and publishing were taught to me in terms of what makes them distinct from one another goes back to my aunt Doreen Loder, who worked in the music business from 1959 at Decca Records right the way through to 2012. She ran Ensign Records with Nigel Grange, Lucian's half brother. They were responsible for Sinead O'Connor, who sold 11 million albums based on a Prince cover. And she once said to me, Will, this is how the music industry works. The record label pays for your drugs and the publishing pays for your pension. I just kind of, that's a nice, succinct way of summarizing how the business works. That was then, this is now. Clearly, times have changed, I think. But it reminds us about what makes the business different. And that piece of work that you cite is something called Global Value of Copyright, where I'm really keen to educate this industry regardless of whether you're coming from a label perspective, a manager, an artist, a songwriter. There's a C with a circle on it called copyright. We get that. And it involves record labels, it involves sound exchange, it involves artists, it involves ASCAP, BMI, GMR, SAZAC, it involves publishers, David Israelite and the great folks at the NMPA, it involves street. Put the whole thing together for me, all this spaghetti, and strain it out. And what I was able to show was that in 2020, copyright was worth $32.5 billion, way bigger than what you've just heard from the IFPI, way bigger than what CZEC would say. This is the entire thing. And the split was about 65% to the labels, 35% to the publishers. Now, if you go way back to 2001, when we used to sell CDs by weight of pallet in the cocaine capitalism days of record labels back then, the split was much more in favor of labels, more than three-quarters to labels, less than a quarter to the publishers. And what we've seen happen in the years in between is quite an interesting story. Labels went from boom time with CDs to bust with piracy, and now they're booming again with streaming. And the inverse, the opposite, happened with publishers. As labels went bust, ASCAP BMI kept on reporting record-breaking collections. So you have a hare tortoise analogy here of labels going really fast and falling off a cliff, publishers just trundled along with record-breaking Not massive record-breaking collections, but he kept on growing their base. So the questions these throw up is, what type of industry are we moving towards? Are we going back to a business model which paid labels over 3/4 of the pie and publishers less than a quarter? And is that a good or a bad thing? Or in this post Spotify economy where we're seeing companies like Peloton, Twitch, TikTok come into the business, is that going to have a completely different balance? Now, why this matters to your audience is not just on the creator side, but also on the investment side. You pointed out catalog valuations. We can dig into that if you want, but just a high level point is, let's say that in a few years' time, I go into my back cave again, calculate the global value of copyright, and instead of 32.5 billion, it's 40 billion. I'll come on Trapital and make an exclusive announcement. Copyright today is worth 40 billion. 7.5 billion new dollars have come into this business. I want the audience to start thinking about who gets what share of that marginal new dollar. Is that going to split publishing side or is that going to split label side? And if you're investing in catalogs, be them master rights, be them author rights, that really matters. There's a huge educational drive here to understand the balance of this business of copyright.
So there's a few things you said there that I wanted to dig into. Of course, for streaming, Spotify and its competitors, around 75% is going to the recorded side, a quarter to publishing. But from a breakdown, what does that look like for the TikToks, the Roblox, and the Pelotons? What does that share of revenue from those plays look like?
So the best way I could do this is if I just talk about ratios. There's three R's in this business. There's share of revenue, there's ratio, and there's rights pool. They mean different things. Most experts get confused with these three R's. I'm going to stick to ratios. That is, if I give the label $1, how much do I give the publisher, the songwriter, the collective management organization? So we stick to the conventional streaming model today. I would say that if you give the record label $1, you're giving the publishing side of the fence 24 cents. You know, a decent chunk of change, but still the poorer cousin of the record label. On YouTube, I think it could be as high as 35 cents, 40 cents even, because there's a sync right involved in those deals. And then when you take that observation of imposing the sync right into a deal and you expand it to Peloton or TikTok, potentially even more. And then you can flip it and say, well, what happens if the future of TikTok is karaoke? Not saying it's going to happen, but it's not implausible. If that was the case, that favors publishers even more. So there's all these weird ways the business could develop, which could favor one side of the fence, the labels and the artists continue getting 3/4 of the cash, or the other side of the fence, publishers and songwriters start enforcing their rights and getting a more balanced share. And that's what we need to look out for when we're investing in copyrights. That's what we need to look out for if you're a singer and a songwriter and you're trying to understand your royalty statements.
Mm. Well, like how much higher do you think? I mean, if you had to put a percentage on it for the TikToks or the Pelotons. And I guess as well, you made me think of sync deals, right? Like for the folks that are selling or their song gets placed on one of these Hulu series or one of these HBO Max series. Like, what does that ratio look like, from a ballpark for those?
So I think a 50-50 split would be the upper end of the goal. If a song is placed in a Hulu TV show or, an artist I've worked with for many years, Yumio Deodato, a Brazilian composer, his song's now in this famous EasyJet commercial over here in Europe. The artist and the publisher would see around a 50-50 split of those revenues. Now, would that happen in the world of streaming? Unlikely. But I think if you can get to a stage where you're giving the record label $1 and the publisher 50 cents as a ratio, and I've got to repeat the word ratio here, that's potentially achievable with this post Spotify economy. I don't think it's going to happen with the business we're looking at today, but I think that's a potential scenario for the business developing tomorrow. And that's the thing is, if I can quote Ralph Simon, a longtime mentor to me, he always says, this industry is always about what's happening next. And then he goes on to say, it always has been. That's a great reminder of just, we're restless souls in this business. We've achieved this amazing thing in the past 10 years with streaming. Got that, banked that. What's coming next? Who would have thought Peloton would have had a music licensing department 18 months ago? Now they're like a top 10 account for major labels.
It's impressive. It really is. And I think it's a good reminder because anytime that you get a little bit too bullish and excited about what the current thing is. It's where you always got to be thinking about what's next. And you mentioned a few times about a post Spotify economy. And what does that look
Hmm.
like from your perspective? I think there's likely a number of things that we've already talked about with more of these other B2B platforms or more of these other platforms in general having licensing deals. But when you say or when you think about post Spotify economy, what comes to mind for you?
Let me throw my fist towards your jaw and try and knock you out for a second. We talked about price for a minute, and we talked about streaming. We haven't talked about gaming, but you noticed that Epic Games just acquired Bandcamp. I learned a fascinating stat about Bandcamp, which relates to my book Tarzan Economics. There's a chapter in the book called Make or Buy where I sat down with the management of the band Radiohead, and we went through the entire In Rainbow story for the first time ever, a real global exclusive to explain how that deal worked out, what they were really achieving when they did their voluntary tip jar model. And by the way, can I just put a shout out to one of your listeners, Amp Live from the band Zion? Best remix of Radiohead I've ever heard in my life is Amp Live, Weird Fishies, hip hop version of the entire album. But Radiohead tested voluntary tip jar pricing. Now, check this out. If you put your album out on Bandcamp, it could be a vinyl record. And remember, it's the people who are paying to stream who are also buying vinyl. So if you put an album out on Bandcamp and you say, name your own price, no minimum, and there's a guidance there of $10, the average paid is 14. People go above 40% asking. And that could be for a super rich blockbuster artist who tries something out on Bandcamp. That could be for some band who's broke in Brooklyn, rubbing coins together, trying to make them breathe. People go 40% above asking when you say name your own price. And that's interesting for me. There's a great academic paper by Francesca Cornelli from Duke University. She asked, how should you price a museum? And intuition says, top-down mindset, the museum should set the price. Adults, $10, kids, $5, pensioners, some type of discount arrangement. But she said, no, let the visitors set the price. Because that way, rich people will give you even more and poor people can attend, and you'll see more cash overall. And I would like to see a little bit more of that experimentation around pricing compared to the past 20 years where we've had a ceiling on price, where if you really love a band, all you can give a platform is $9.99 and not a penny more. I think we're suffocating love. We're putting a ceiling on love. We need to take that ceiling and smash through it and let people express love through different means. But I love that Bandcamp story. Whatever you suggest, I'll give you 40% above because it's art. We're not dealing with commodity, we're dealing with culture. And that's what we've got to remind ourselves.
It's like the Met model, right? Where at least the last time I went, it was like $20 was the recommendation. But to your point, it at least set some barrier of a threshold. But a lot of the people that go there that have a lot of money end up giving much more. So I hear you on that. I noticed though when you're talking and thinking about the future of this, I didn't hear many of the typical buzzwords and things that you hear about the music industry now, whether it is NFTs or Web3 or the metaverse. Well, maybe to some extent with the Epic Games comparison, but what is your take on that piece of the post Spotify era?
I need to put $1 in a glass every time I hear these words. So I'm just back from Austin, Texas, South by Southwest. Vague recollections of what happened over there, but I'm telling you, those words were bouncing around more than anything else. Here's a way of capturing it for your listeners. This is the first time I've been to South by Southwest where nobody asked me what band did I see last night. Everybody asked me what VR headset did I try this morning. And that's a sign of the times, Dan. That is a sign of the times. Hey, did you try the Amaze VR headset? You know, the Meg the Stallion booty tour? Yeah, I tried that this morning. What band nobody wanted to know about bands with pulses. Everybody wanted to know about VR headsets. So we live in interesting times. I think we're in a bit of bubble trouble here. I really do. I don't think this whole thing has been thought out correctly. Firstly, I'll give you an example of where I think the problem's gone wrong. And secondly, I want to give you an example from history to show that we've been here before. So with NFTs, it is not it's not an example of a woman who is happy to spend thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on a handbag because they can walk up and down Sixth Avenue and people will see that woman carrying that handbag. The signaling value isn't there. You know, I can buy a token that says I've seen the Mona Lisa on this day and put it in my locker. And if I show you my locker, you can see that I've seen the Mona Lisa that day. And you could buy a token and put it in your locker, and you could show your friends that you've seen the Mona Lisa that day. But nobody can buy the Mona Lisa. We can just buy this NFT adaptation of the Mona Lisa. But we can't share it across platforms. And that's where I'm struggling. That's where I'm struggling. As irrational as it might be to spend $20,000, $30,000 on a handbag, if that makes you feel good having the world see you wear it, fine. Do what you got to do. But with NFTs, it is not a cross-platform token, and I'm worried that that's a problem with the model. With the price of NFTs, just very quickly, there is a term I want to introduce to your show called wash trades, which were made illegal in 1936, which is basically if you're selling your house, you might employ an estate agent on the buy side as well as the sell side to cook up the price. And you can see if you try to do this in the stock market, you spend a lot of time in the chokey, 6 years in jail for manipulating prices. Wash trades have been illegal since 1936. I think there's a problem with wash trades manipulating the price of NFTs because they're unregulated. So I don't want to be the dour pessimistic Scottish economist in the room here and pour cold water on this hype machine, but I have some issues with the product and I have some issues with the price. The product is stuck to your locker and your locker only, and the price could be manipulated by ways which would be declared illegal in financial markets, conventional financial markets. Fine. Wrap that up. Here's my lesson from history. Now, Dan, in your record collection, do you remember a rock band called Kiss?
Oh, yeah.
Were you a member of Kiss Army by any chance?
I was not.
You can admit it on the show. Okay, I didn't think so. Right, so if we go back to before I was born, 1975, Kiss, one of the biggest rock bands in America, had something called Kiss Army for their super fans. So you could have Kiss wallpaper, Kiss models. You could even have Kiss toilet paper. That was one of their top sellers. You could wipe your bahookie with Gene Simmons. That was one of their biggest sellers. And in 1975, they ran a competition. And the competition was to say, hey, fans, if you want to see a picture of the band with the makeup off, they had this famous black and white makeup, we're going to have this competition. You pay to enter, and 5 lucky winners would be sent a photograph of the band with the makeup off. Now you're thinking, NFTs, Kiss 1975, where's he going? Follow me. Hysteria breaks out. All these Kiss fans in the Kiss Army want to see Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley with the makeup off. So crazy hype around the competition. The winners are announced. The envelopes are sent out. Those 5 lucky winners get the envelope. They need scissors to open the envelope. They pull out this black and white photograph of Kiss with the makeup off. And after 5 seconds of exposure to natural light, the picture fades. Genius, genius marketing. Incredible. But I'm struggling to see the difference between that in 1975, Kiss, competing for photographs which fade in natural light, and NFTs today. So something I stress in my book, Tarzan Economics, is when you stare into disruption, it's really important to remind yourself that you've been here before. And I think Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley have been here before.
It's an interesting take. And I do think about the first piece of what you were saying, just in terms of something that stays in your wallet and how do you share that elsewhere. I have seen some of the social platforms making it easier to be like, oh, hey, you could connect your Coinbase wallet to this, whether it's Instagram, I think they're working on it now, or to Twitter, and you can make that your profile picture. Or you have the people that, of course, will right click, copy, paste, and save and put that as their profile pictures in different places. So I guess in their minds, that's their version of being able to walk down Fifth Ave with the Duty and Burke bag, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And that to your point, that takes you back into handbag territory. That corrects for the problem. Let's see if it goes. But equally, does the NFT lose its exclusivity when we do that as well? So it might work in the short term. It might lead to the demise of NFTs over the long term because they're not that special after all. They're just an icon for your profile picture. So it's great to hear that there's that type of thinking going on that justifies my view.
Who knows? I mean, we're still early, right? But I do think that if I see your profile on social media and you turn into a bored ape, we may have to have another podcast conversation to check in.
But I tell you, Austin was obsessed with these topics. Austin, Texas, music conferences get obsessed with the next big thing. But this year, it was just bizarre how many references I heard to Web3 NFTs. But if I can, just give a quick shout out to the company Amaze VR, who are doing the Meg the Stallion tour. I watched Meg the Stallion 4 times in Austin, Texas. I saw more VR of Meg the Stallion than I saw of any live band. But they had the longest queues of the entire conference. If you judge success by queues, demand exceeding supply, they won South by Southwest with the longest queues.
That's impressive. And of course, Meg's a big star. She's been doing a lot. I've heard a lot of good things from Amaze VR too. But I think on that note, it'd be a great point to pivot and talk a little bit more about hip hop. As we know, hip hop has been able to see a lot of its potential even more so in the streaming
Mm.
era, just given the popularity that's there. We've seen the numbers, we've seen the growth as well. And I know that you study this a lot, especially on the international perspective, just seeing how hip hop is growing in other countries. But I think some of that growth is looking different than what we may be used to seeing in the US. So, what is your perspective right now on the state of hip hop with regards to streaming?
You're speaking about something that's close to my heart, but if I can start by saying one thing that your podcast has done for me over the years is it reminds us of that famous quote, which has been reiterated by many a rapper, which is rap is something you do, hip hop is something you live. And we can forget that from time to time. We can drink a bit too much Kool-Aid and forget those golden words. Rap is something that you do, hip hop is something that you live. And you don't have a choice with hip hop, you live it. Rap, I mean, you could play a jazz track, then you could do a rap track. You have a choice there, but hip hop is innate. And I want to pull those words up because when we talk about the genre of hip hop, I wonder whether it's really a bit of a square peg in a round hole here to take words which for me describe a lifestyle, an attitude, a mentality, and then say that is now a genre. Maybe rap should be the genre and hip hop should be the culture. So I just want to throw that out there for your listeners. And I'd love future guests to come on and pose them that question. If we're discussing the genre of hip hop, are we missing a trick? That aside, some stuff which has been popping with hip hop. I mean, firstly, just the size of the audience in America, I put it just north of 90 million people. That is 90 million regular listeners of hip hop. That is phenomenal if you think about how far the genre has come, the culture has come in 30 plus years. And secondly, who's out there in front? I mean, I would put YouTube as the number one venue for hip hop in the United States. Spotify, Apple, Amazon, they're all doing their things, but I think it's worth just reminding ourselves how important YouTube is to our culture as opposed to Amazon, Spotify, Apple is to pressing your thumb on a piece of glass and hearing a track. Repeat. Rap is something you do, hip hop is something you live. And you've had Tuma Basa, one of my longtime mentors on your show, just wheel back to that past podcast to get to where I'm coming from on that point. I think the interesting thing for me, speaking as a non-American on a podcast with a large American audience, is to watch how it's growing out of the countries. And one of the most interesting things for me was non-English speaking hip hop. Now, my sister, who's a French translator, Annie, she introduced me to a rapper called MC Solar way, way back in the day, back in the 90s even. And I don't speak French, but the rap was just incredible. Like the way that the French language flowed over a beat, qui sème les vents, recolle le tempo, that was incredible. So, I've always had an appreciation for how hip hop travels beyond its borders. Playlists are without borders, hip hop is without borders. So I just wanted to introduce your audience to a very interesting backstory in Holland, in the Netherlands, where Spotify, the first country we scaled in outside of Norway and Sweden was the Netherlands. We got big there really quickly, 2011, 2012 era. And because we got big, we could put some local foot soldiers on the ground to help with curation. And for the first time ever in the company's history, we started taking hip hop curation seriously outside of our core markets. And because we were supplying curation, that was met with demand. And all of a sudden, we started seeing these Dutch language hip hop artists explode in Holland, Ronnie Flex being a great example. I think around 2018, we ran the data and we learned that Drake was the number one artist in the world on Spotify. Yet in Holland, he was the eighth biggest hip hop artist, and the seven above him were Dutch, rapping in their local language of Dutch. And that was just jaw dropping to think about globalization, culture, back to the Jungle Brothers, the lesson they taught me in 1989, getting the message across without crossing over, how you can have local language hip hop travel like no other genre there is. across the world. And you're seeing that happen in Germany, France, you're seeing it happen in Asia now. So it's important to apply a global lens to hip hop and ask, what is it about this culture which is leading it to travel in a way that other cultures are not traveling? Is it the expression? Is it the belief? Is it the conviction that comes through hip hop? And that's that. There's a book in that topic. If, Dan, you'd be a perfect person to try and write it. I can get you an agent, but I'd be out of my depth. But just it's a really important seed to sow, which is why is this culture traveling like no other culture I can see on a music platform?
It's fascinating. It's something I've thought about a lot, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I think about a rapper like Divine from India, or I think about some of the artists from the Middle East as well, and I think there's been similar trends there where hip hop is still the most dominant thing, but their artists that are from their regions are the ones that are the most popular. And I think it stems back to thinking about the origins of hip hop and looking at where a lot of those other countries may be now. You look at what Public Enemy had done, or you even look a bit earlier to what Grandmaster Flash and them have done, they're sharing
Wow.
realities of the environments that they're in, and they're storytelling in a way that isn't being done by the mass media. And we're in an era now, more than ever, we see everything happening in the world where what a lot of the heads of states or what a lot of the governments or main distribution communication platforms in these countries are sharing isn't necessarily reflecting what's happening in those places. So because of that, you have people wanting to speak out on that. And I think that because people realizing what Public Enemy was able to do in some of those other groups here by them saying, we are the Black CNN, we are the voice communicating that. I think you saw a lot of that in these other countries. So even if it's different artists, you're seeing them share their version of what's happening on the ground. And I think, like anything else, the evolution of that continues to grow over time. It's been really fascinating to see that. And I think that is what, at least for me, always makes it feel like this is the global language that keeps everyone connected in this space. Even if people are speaking completely different languages from artists you don't know, there's that common theme that you can tell, even if you're watching a music video or getting a vibe of what they're doing. There's so many through lines there.
Those comments are deeper than Loch Ness. If I can quickly top it up with two thoughts, just thinking aloud here, Dan. And this is what I love about your podcast is with the way you take the conversation, but just firstly, just a historical point. And as I mentioned with my book, Tarzan Economics, when you're staring at disruption, to remind yourself that you've been here before. When I hear stories about suppression by governments leading to a rise of hip hop as a culture, rap as an art form, you just got to go back to 1877, New Orleans, and remind yourselves how jazz came into being. Creole people, when Jim Crow laws were reintroduced through the back door, were forced into the African American community overnight. So you took classically trained middle class Creole people and brought them to a culture which had the blues and African drumming. And out of that suppression came the creation that was jazz. And it's just, I love when you alluded to government suppression resulting in creativity. It's just interesting to think how we keep on, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And it's rhyming here when you start to think about the origins of jazz to what we're seeing happen with hip hop. And then the second thing I mentioned earlier that, the internet can scale just about anything you want, but it can't scale intimacy. I wonder whether that's what hip hop is doing. Is it's a postcard, it's storytelling, it's beginning with the word imagine and asking you to imagine the picture these words are creating. And that's doing something which I don't think your conventional verse, chorus, rock or pop song is going to deliver. So the message, getting the message across without crossing over, the message that we're getting across with hip hop is different from other forms of music. And that might explain a little bit about its success at home and overseas that we've seen on streaming.
Definitely. Well, Will, this is great. Thanks again for coming on. If you're listening,
An honor.
definitely make sure that you check out Tarzan Economics. I can't recommend this book enough. I think that Will is extremely sharp and he's a thought leader in this space, and it's been great to learn from him. So, Will, thanks for coming on. And before we let you go, is there anything else that you want to plug or let the Trapital audience know about?
Um, I have got no more travel plans to the States this year, but if I can just ask the audience to check out the mix on Mixcloud. We ain't done with 2021, with a shout out from Dan Runcie himself and many others. Mike G is on that mix, Lord is on that mix. But I just hope that your audience, because the show Trapital means so much to me, I just hope the audience see me as a DJ first and an economist a distant second. If I can just land that point at the end of this podcast, I'd be happy.
That's a great note to end on. Will, thanks again.
Thank you so much.